On our 5th anniversary, my husband took me on a trip so beautiful that if I had died the way he expected me to, everyone would have called it tragic, poetic, and horribly unlucky. There would have been photos of ocean cliffs, candlelit dinners, wind in my hair, and a husband who looked devastated in all the right places. People would have said what a terrible accident it was, how cruel life can be, how no one could have seen it coming. And for about 48 hours after I almost died, that is exactly what I believed too. I believed I had survived a nightmare by sheer luck. I believed my husband was shaken because he nearly lost me. I believed the strange details bothering me were just trauma looking for a shape. Then I got home, started putting the pieces together, and realized something that made surviving the water feel simple compared to what came next. I had not almost died during a romantic anniversary trip. I had almost died during a trip my husband had designed with terrifying precision. Before I tell you how I figured it out, tell me where you're watching from tonight. When I married Ethan, the thing everyone admired most about him was how thoughtful he seemed. He was not the loud kind of charming. He was the polished, observant kind. He remembered dates. He booked things in advance. He sent flowers on ordinary Tuesdays. He always knew which restaurant had the good corner table and which gift felt personal instead of expensive. If we were running late, he had already found a faster route. If I had a rough week, he had somehow noticed before I said it out loud. Being married to him felt, for a long time, like being married to competence shaped into care. People envied me for it. My friends used to say he had the soul of an old-fashioned gentleman and the efficiency of a military planner. I laughed when they said that. Later, much later, I would realize that what looked romantic in a safe man can look chilling in the wrong one. Thoughtfulness and calculation often use the same skills. The difference is intent. The first 3 years of our marriage were good enough that if someone had shown me a preview of how this story ends, I would have accused them of projecting their own bitterness onto my life. Ethan and I were not one of those couples who lived in dramatic chaos. We did not fight loudly. We did not break up and get back together. We paid our bills, took weekend trips, hosted friends, talked about maybe trying for a baby after I made one more career move, and built what looked from the outside like a life made of mature, sensible love. But the 4th year is where subtle things started to shift, and because they were subtle, I did what so many women do when the mood of a marriage changes without obvious cause. I blamed stress before I blamed betrayal. Ethan's company had been going through a messy reorganization. He worked in corporate development for a hospitality group, which meant he knew how to sell experience, smooth over complications, and make expensive things feel effortless. Long hours became normal. His mood changed in ways that were hard to describe and therefore easy to dismiss. He was not cruel. He was distracted. Not absent exactly, but harder to reach emotionally. If I asked what was wrong, he said he was exhausted. If I said we felt off, he would pull me into his chest, kiss my forehead, and say I was reading too much into a rough quarter. There is that phrase again, one women hear all the time in stories like mine, reading too much into it. It is a wonderfully useful sentence when a man wants to calm a situation without actually clarifying anything. Around that same time, Ethan became intensely interested in our finances in a way he had never been before. We had always handled things together. Shared spreadsheets, shared accounts, shared long-term planning. Then gradually, he started wanting to simplify certain things. He offered to take over some payments because he said my workload had been brutal lately. He suggested moving money around for tax efficiency. He started talking more often about risk, coverage, liability, asset protection, the sort of language that sounds responsible until you realize it is arriving in your marriage before any real reason has been given. Because he worked around luxury hospitality and travel, I was used to him being detail-oriented. I did not immediately treat that shift as sinister. At most, I thought he was becoming slightly controlling under stress. I remember even telling a friend once, half joking, that Ethan had developed the energy of a very attractive insurance broker. If I had understood then what he was actually preparing, I don't know whether I would have laughed or vomited. One of the reasons I ignored my own discomfort was that every time my instincts started whispering that something was off, Ethan would do something beautifully timed that made me feel foolish for doubting him. He would come home with my favorite pastry from the bakery near my office. He would send me an article about a place he wanted to take me, once life settles down. He would remember the anniversary of our first date, while I had honestly forgotten the exact day. He was excellent at keeping just enough warmth in circulation that I never fully trusted the coldness gathering underneath. And if you have never been in a relationship like that, let me explain what it does to your mind. It does not make you feel unloved. It makes you feel unstable for noticing inconsistency. That is much more useful to a liar. About 6 months before the trip, I had a strange conversation with Ethan that stayed in my head longer than it should have. We were at dinner with another couple, old friends of his from college, and somehow the conversation drifted toward life insurance because one of them had just become a father and was talking about practical adulthood like it was a newly discovered disease. Everyone laughed. Then Ethan said, in this weirdly casual tone, that people do not think seriously enough about worst-case scenarios until life forces them to. He started talking about policies, beneficiary structures, and how quickly legal chaos can follow an unexpected death if paperwork is not handled correctly. It was not what he said so much as how much he seemed to know, and how comfortable he was saying it over steak and wine like normal dinner conversation. His friend joked that he sounded disturbingly prepared, and Ethan laughed and said, "I like contingencies." Everyone moved on. I did too, outwardly. But inwardly, I remember thinking, contingencies for what? Maybe if that moment had stood alone, it would mean nothing. But later, after the water, after the hospital, after what I found on his laptop, that memory came back sharp enough to cut me. That's one of the ugliest parts of realizing you were almost killed by someone you trusted. The past starts rearranging itself. Scenes you filed away as odd or off-color come back with new meaning. The man you loved does not turn into a monster overnight. He turns into one retroactively. 2 months before our anniversary, Ethan announced that he had planned a trip for us. Not a vague idea, not a we should get away sometime, but a fully formed plan. Flights booked, hotel reserved, transfers arranged, activities chosen. He told me he wanted to make up for how distant he had been and said that this trip was about us resetting before another year swallowed us whole. He had picked a stunning coastal destination known for luxury villas, dramatic cliffs, private boat tour, and the kind of sunsets that make mediocre marriages look romantic in photos. I was touched, deeply touched if I'm honest. We had both been strained, and part of me was relieved that he seemed aware of it. He said he had chosen it because he knew I loved the ocean but hated crowded resort towns. He said the place was quiet, intimate, and perfect for remembering what mattered. It embarrasses me now how exactly that language was built for me, remembering what mattered. A quiet place, intimate, secluded, beautiful, controlled. The trip itself began almost perfectly. That matters because if the beginning had felt wrong, I would have been on guard. Instead, everything was gorgeous. The villa overlooked the water from a high stone terrace. There were white curtains moving in the ocean wind, chilled wine waiting in the room, flowers on the table, and a handwritten note from the hotel congratulating us on our anniversary. Ethan seemed softer there, almost like the version of himself I had been missing. He took my photo at golden hour. He held my waist walking through town. He suggested we leave our phones in the room one afternoon and just wander without a plan like we used to. He said all the right things in the right tone with the right timing. If someone had filmed the first day and a half of that trip, it would have looked like an expensive advertisement for surviving modern life through marriage. And still, there were moments that scratched at me, tiny ones. He was oddly interested in where the staff kept emergency equipment near the private dock. He asked our guide on the first morning about tide schedules with a level of focus that felt too intense for casual curiosity. During dinner on the second night, he asked whether I ever thought about how quickly things can change in water, how one wrong moment in the ocean can erase years of plans. I laughed and said that was a dark anniversary topic, and he smiled in that familiar way he used when he wanted to look like he was joking while also testing how far a sentence could go. He raised his glass and said, "To surviving everything." At the time, I thought it was slightly strange. Nothing more. Strange. Human beings can survive on that word for a very long time. Strange is much easier than dangerous. The activity that nearly killed me was scheduled for the final full day of the trip. Ethan had arranged a private boat excursion with a company that specialized in hidden coastline experiences, which should have sounded pretentious enough to annoy me, but instead sounded exactly like something he would find. The plan was simple on paper: a scenic ride along the cliffs, lunch in a tiny cove, some swimming, and then a stop at a famous overlook accessible from the water. I almost opted out because I had not slept well the night before, but Ethan looked genuinely excited, and that had become rare enough that I wanted to meet him there. He kissed my forehead, told me this would be the memory we laughed about when we were old, and handed me sunscreen. The first part of the excursion was beautiful, insanely beautiful. The kind of beauty that feels staged, like no real place should be able to look that cinematic. The water shifted between deep blue and impossible green depending on the light. The cliffs were brutal and elegant at the same time, all sharp edges and sunlit stone. We took photos. We had champagne from a cooler. The guide was local, easygoing, and clearly used to honeymooners wanting curated moments. Ethan seemed relaxed. More than relaxed, actually. Focused. That is the word I would use now. Focused in a way that read then as attentive and reads now as intent. We reached the cove just after noon. It was smaller than I expected, almost enclosed, with a narrow rocky ledge on one side and deeper water than looked safe near the cliff line. The guide anchored and explained where it was fine to swim and where the current could shift without warning. He said that if we stayed inside a certain line, we would be fine, but that the area closer to the rock opening could pull stronger than people expect. Ethan asked several follow-up questions. Too many, maybe. Again, if I had been watching a stranger instead of my husband, maybe I would have registered that. But marriage gives people endless credit. That is one of its most dangerous features. I remember the exact chain of moments because trauma preserves details in a cruelly bright way. I remember adjusting the strap of my swimsuit. I remember Ethan teasing me for overpacking 3 different cover-ups for one boat trip. I remember stepping into the water and flinching at the first cold shock against my skin. I remember hearing the guide say something about staying to the left of a certain marker. I remember Ethan calling out that the water was calmer near the rocks than it looked. Then I remember the current. If you have never been pulled by water unexpectedly, it is hard to describe how personal it feels. One second you are swimming. The next, the world has changed its mind about whether you belong in it. I was not dragged dramatically under all at once. It was subtler and therefore more terrifying. My body stopped moving where I intended it to move. I kicked harder and somehow stayed in the same wrong place. Then something beneath the surface shifted, and I was pulled sideways fast enough that panic arrived before logic did. I shouted Ethan's name. I heard him shout something back, but not the words. The guide was moving. The boat tilted slightly as someone shifted weight. I tried to correct my body and swallowed water so suddenly that my chest burned. My hand scraped rock. I remember the taste of salt and blood. Then the current grabbed harder. There is a moment in drowning, or near drowning, where the body understands what the mind is still trying to negotiate. I did not think I am dying. I thought, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I saw the light fracture above me. I heard muffled sounds that might have been shouting. My lungs became one enormous panic. Something struck my shoulder. I fought upward and got half a breath. Then the pull took me again, and for one bright, horrifying second I saw Ethan's face above the waterline. Not reaching me, not diving in, watching. I have replayed that image more than any other, because at first I told myself it was shock. Of course it was shock. What else could it be? Your husband sees you disappearing under rough water, of course he freezes. Of course his face looks wrong. Of course memory distorts. That is what I told myself later in the hospital when the nurse asked if I remembered losing consciousness. But that look on his face was not panic. Panic moves toward the danger or away from it. His face held something colder, calculation interrupted by surprise. The guide got to me first, not Ethan. The guide. He came in from the angle the current was pulling toward, caught my arm, and shouted at me to stop fighting against it the wrong way. I do not remember all of it clearly. I remember another burst of water in my mouth, a violent drag against my ribcage, then the raw agony of being half-hauled, half-shoved toward safer water. I remember coughing so hard I thought I would split in half. I remember the guide and one of the staff from the boat getting me back on board. I remember lying on the deck shaking, vomiting seawater, hearing someone say my lips were turning blue. And I remember Ethan kneeling beside me, touching my face, saying my name over and over in a voice that sounded perfectly horrified. That is what made what came later so confusing. He played the role beautifully. On the boat, at the clinic, during the first few hours at the hospital, he was attentive, frightened, devoted. He answered questions. He held my hand. He told everyone I had been pulled by a current faster than either of us understood. He said if the guide had been 1 second later, he could not even bear to think about it. The doctor said I was incredibly lucky. A little more water, a little longer without help, a slightly different angle against the rocks, and the story might have ended there. I had bruising on my shoulder and ribs, some mild complications from inhaling seawater, and an exhaustion so deep it felt cellular. Ethan kissed my forehead and said, "I almost lost you." I believed him, or maybe I needed to. But two things bothered me immediately, even before the investigation inside my own mind began. First, the guide would not look at Ethan for very long. He was professional, polite, calm, but every time Ethan repeated the story in front of him, there was this strange tension in the guide's face, like he was deciding whether something was worth saying. Second, Ethan kept emphasizing how quickly everything had happened while also giving oddly precise details about the conditions. Too precise. He talked about the current pattern, the angle, the timing, the unpredictability, the exact danger zone. It sounded less like a man describing a shock and more like a man defending a mechanism. We cut the trip short and flew home 2 days later. During the flight, Ethan hovered. He adjusted my pillow, got me water, kept asking whether my chest hurt, whether I was dizzy, whether I needed to close my eyes. If anyone had looked at us, they would have seen a husband lovingly shepherding his fragile wife home after a terrible accident. I leaned my head against the window and tried to ignore the feeling growing under my skin that something was not settling the way trauma usually settles. People think suspicion arrives like lightning. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives like a stain spreading slowly through fabric, quietly, relentlessly. At home, I spent the first week recovering. Bruising darkened along my side. Breathing deeply still hurt. My throat burned at odd times from salt water and panic. Friends sent flowers. My mother cried on the phone. Ethan took care of everything. Too much, almost. He worked from home. He brought me soup. He checked my prescriptions. He insisted I rest and said he did not want me worrying about anything practical. Once again, if this were someone else's story, I would tell her that overcompensation after almost losing a spouse is normal. It is, but that is the problem with men who know how to perform care. They always operate inside the range of what could still be explained kindly. The first real crack came from something stupid, a folder. Ethan had always been obsessive about digital organization, and one afternoon while he was out picking up medication, I used his laptop because mine was in my office, and I was too sore to go upstairs. I wanted to pull a receipt from our travel insurance provider because the hospital abroad had given me paperwork I needed to submit. Ethan had told me not to worry about any of it. That is precisely why I worried. I logged into the shared email account, started searching terms related to the trip, and found a folder he had created labeled simply contingency. There are innocent uses for that word: budgets, travel backup docs, work papers. But after the conversation at dinner months earlier, after the way he had said he liked contingencies, seeing that label made my pulse start hammering. I opened it. Inside were PDFs, screenshots, policy documents, emergency contact lists, copies of our insurance information, scanned versions of my passport, and a note titled "If Unreachable." At first glance, everything looked administrative. Then I saw the date stamps. He had assembled the folder the week before the anniversary trip. Not months before, not gradually, not as part of general life organization. In one concentrated burst. I opened the travel insurance file. The coverage had been adjusted. Specifically adjusted. Not increased broadly, but changed in certain categories related to accidental death and repatriation. My name, his name, beneficiary fields, emergency processing notes. I sat there staring at the screen until my vision blurred. Even then, even with that, I still did what women are practically trained to do in marriages that do not yet have undeniable villainy attached to them. I looked for the innocent explanation first. Maybe he had become obsessive after the work stress. Maybe he was just trying to be prepared for international travel. Maybe the folder existed because he was anxious, not because he was dangerous. But that same afternoon, While still trembling from what I found, I discovered something that shattered the innocence beyond repair. It was his search history. People forget how much our search history reveals because it often feels too fragmented to be meaningful. But context is everything. There, in the weeks leading up to the trip, were searches that looked normal enough in isolation. Coastal tide charts, private cove access, current patterns, emergency response times near our resort, cliffside boat excursion reviews. That could still fit under planning. Then came the others. How long can someone survive secondary drowning symptoms? Common assumptions after accidental tourist drowning. Travel insurance accidental death waiting periods. Best time of day for strongest current in location. My hands went numb. There was one search that I still remember word for word because I think some part of me will die with it engraved in me. If spouse dies abroad, what documents needed immediately? You cannot unsee that. You cannot generously interpret that once it sits beside the water in your lungs and the rocks against your shoulder. I remember physically pushing the laptop away from me and stumbling to the bathroom to throw up, which was impressive considering I had barely eaten. My body understood before my mind fully accepted it. Ethan had not just planned a beautiful trip. He had researched my death as an administrative possibility. After that, every memory of the trip changed shape at once. The questions to the guide, the interest in emergency equipment, the way he suggested the water was calmer near the rocks, the precision of his retelling afterward, the look on his face when I surfaced the second time. None of it was abstract anymore. It was pattern, intent, design, and somehow the most terrifying part was not that I now believed he had wanted me dead. It was that, if the guide had not reacted as fast as he did, Ethan might have gotten away with it completely. I did not confront him immediately. I know some people expect a dramatic scene right there. A smashed laptop, a scream, a weaponized truth. But when the person you suspect almost killed you is still in your house, sleeping beside you, tracking your movements, and under the impression that you know nothing, drama is a luxury for safer women than I was at that moment. No. What I needed first was distance disguised as normality. I needed to become the worst kind of wife for a man like Ethan, a wife who knows and does not show it. So I became careful. I took photos of the screen with my phone instead of forwarding anything from his devices. I copied document names, timestamps, policy numbers, and search terms. I sent everything to my sister using a subject line we had agreed long ago would mean emergency if one of us ever needed it. I did not tell her details in that first message. I just wrote, "Do not call. Read attachments. I need to leave carefully." Within 12 minutes, she replied with exactly what I needed. Understood. Tell me what you need me to do. If you are wondering why I did not go to the police that second, understand that suspicion, proof, and prosecutable evidence are not the same thing. I had enough to know I was in danger. I did not yet know I had enough to make anyone else move fast enough to protect me before Ethan understood he was exposed. Over the next 3 days, I played recovery while quietly dismantling access. I moved small amounts of money that would not trigger his attention. I changed passwords from a device he never touched. I made an appointment with an attorney under the pretense of a follow-up medical consultation. I called the travel insurance provider and asked for full documentation of all changes made to our coverage in the previous 6 months. I contacted the excursion company by email saying I wanted to thank the guide who saved my life and would they please tell me his full name. I phrased it sweetly and gratefully. They responded within hours. His name was Matteo. That mattered because I needed to know whether he had seen more than he said on the boat. The most difficult part of those days was Ethan himself, because he remained almost perfectly attentive. He made tea. He fluffed pillows. He asked whether I was sleeping. At one point, he stood in the kitchen making me soup while I watched the back of the man who may have tried to kill me and had to remind myself not to stare too hard. It is difficult to explain the horror of domestic normalcy when you know violence may be living inside it. He kissed my temple one evening and said, "I don't know what I'd do if I actually lost you." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood how many true things people say while lying. He didn't know what he would do if he lost me, because he had planned for that too carefully for it to remain emotional. Matteo, the guide, turned out to be the key that took my private terror and gave it an external spine. Once I had his name, I found him through the excursion company and asked if he would be willing to speak to me privately because there were details of the accident I couldn't stop replaying. I expected politeness or refusal. Instead, he replied with one line that made my chest go ice cold. There are things I thought were strange that day. We arranged a call for the next morning while Ethan was in the shower. Mateo was cautious, but not vague. He said he had hesitated to say anything at first because accidents happen near that cove more often than tourists realize, and he did not want to create distress where none existed. But he admitted that Ethan had asked unusually detailed questions before the excursion and had specifically requested that cove even though there were calmer routes with better scenery. He admitted that Ethan had been told twice where the current shifted hardest and had still directed me verbally toward the more dangerous side, though indirectly enough that it could be defended later as confusion. Then Mateo said the sentence that locked the whole thing into place for me. He said, "When you went under the first time, your husband did not move like someone trying to save you. He moved like someone waiting to see if he needed to." I had to mute myself because I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. Not grief exactly. Confirmation. There is something devastating about hearing your worst suspicions spoken by another person in calm, practical language. Mateo said he had considered reporting the situation formally to his company, but without clear evidence, he worried it would sound like accusation born from hindsight. He apologized for not having spoken up sooner. I thanked him anyway because by then I was no longer floating in my own fear alone. I had a witness, not to intent beyond doubt, but to the wrongness of his behavior in the moment when my life depended on him. What happened next was not glamorous. It was paperwork, legal calls, and the ugly work of turning fear into structure. My attorney advised me to leave the house first and talk second. A police report was filed, though carefully, because they could document my concerns and the suspicious planning, but could not magically arrest a husband for almost drowning his wife where currents really do exist. My sister and brother-in-law came for me while Ethan was at work. We packed essentials, documents, jewelry, my laptop, medication, and every external hard drive in the house. I left no note. I did, however, leave one thing on the kitchen counter, a printed copy of his search history with the line, "If spouse dies abroad, what documents needed immediately," highlighted in yellow. No explanation, just that. If he wanted to pretend innocence, he could begin with himself. He called me 17 times in the first hour after he got home. Then came the messages, first confusion, then concern, then anger at my dramatic disappearance, then a flood of explanations. He said he could explain the searches. He said they were work-related because his job involved travel risk planning. He said the insurance changes were standard. He said I was traumatized and not thinking clearly. That last one was almost impressive in its audacity. The man who may have designed a near-death accident for his wife was now trying to pathologize her fear of him. But by then, I had stopped looking for logic in his lies. Lies are not there to make sense. They are there to slow you down. The first time we met after I left was in a lawyer's office. Not for reconciliation, not for closure, for safety and record. Ethan looked terrible, and again, this is important to say because evil rarely looks theatrical in expensive shoes. He looked tired, frightened, drawn, genuinely shaken. He cried. He said he loved me. He said he had made stupid searches because he panicked after the accident and wanted to understand insurance and emergency procedures. He said the folder existed because he likes to be prepared when traveling. He said if he asked questions about currents, it was because he wanted to avoid danger, not cause it. He said Mateo must have misread the situation. He said I was turning coincidences into a nightmare because trauma had distorted everything. Then I asked him why the folder was assembled before the trip. That was the first moment he truly lost rhythm. Tried to pivot. He said he likes to prepare early. I asked why the policy changes were made a week before we left. He said the original coverage was inadequate. I asked why he searched accidental tourist drownings and immediate paperwork for spousal death before I ever went near the water. He looked at me for a long time and said very softly, "I knew you'd take things out of context if you ever saw that." That was his reflex, not sorrow, not horror at how it looked. My unreliability. My context problem. My mind. I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, even now, even here, he still thinks my confusion is more useful to him than the truth. And maybe that would have been enough for him to keep trying, if not for the financial trail that emerged while he was busy defending the emotional one. Because once my attorney started digging into our insurance and account structures, we found more. Not enough to turn this into some easy television plot where every motive sits in a neat file, but enough. Ethan had more debt than I knew, private investment losses, pressure from something he had hidden under the surface of our marriage. There were communications with a lender that made timing suddenly matter a great deal. There were calculations about coverage and liquidation. There was no single smoking gun email that said, "I plan to kill my wife on our anniversary trip," because men who can do things like this are rarely that stupid. But there was a pattern of desperate money problems, carefully adjusted policies, targeted research, and one nearly fatal incident arranged inside a setting he fully controlled. Friends and family asked later how I knew, really knew, instead of merely suspected. The answer is not one document. It is the total shape of a person when the mask slips. It is the fact that my husband arranged a private trip, chose a dangerous cove after asking unusually specific questions, directed me toward the wrong area after being warned, failed to move the way a loving spouse moves when the woman he loves is drowning, had already updated policies and compiled death-adjacent documents, researched the practical aftermath of spousal death before the trip, and then tried to convince me that all of it could be explained if only I distrusted myself one last time. At some point, requiring one more perfect piece of proof is just another way women are taught to die politely. The separation became public slowly, and then all at once. At first, we told almost no one why I had left. I said only that after the accident, I had learned things I could not live with. But stories leak, especially in circles where Ethan had spent years performing decency. Some people believed me quickly because something in them had always found his perfection too polished. Others looked at me with that particular discomfort reserved for women who say terrifying things in calm voices. A few implied I was letting trauma make me cruel. Those people disappeared from my life, and I do not miss them. My mother, however, said one thing that I have carried ever since. She said, "A man doesn't have to confess for a woman to know when she has seen death in his eyes." I think she understood immediately what I had been struggling to explain. For months after I left, I woke up with water in my body that was not really there. I would hear the cove in my sleep. I would feel the drag at my legs stepping into a shower. Sometimes the most haunting part was not the moment under the surface, but the memory of his face above it. That was the image that stayed. Not because it was monstrous in some dramatic, movie-like way. Because it was. It was almost normal. That is what made it unbearable. A husband watching his wife disappear and not yet deciding whether to help. There is no scarier expression than hesitation where love should be instinct. You might be wondering what the payoff was, because stories like this need one. They need more than survival. They need consequence. And I would be lying if I said the payoff was simple or cinematic. There was no one dazzling courtroom confession, no single day where everyone gasped and Ethan collapsed under the weight of his own evil. Real life is often less neat than that, but consequences came anyway, and they came in ways that mattered. His company learned enough about the investigation and the financial irregularities to distance itself from him. Certain people who had admired his composure started seeing it as something else entirely. The excursion company filed its own internal report once I gave them everything I had. Our shared financial structures were frozen and untangled. He lost access to the version of himself he had curated most carefully. The thoughtful husband, the polished planner, the safe pair of hands. And the most satisfying part, strangely, was not anything public. It was private. It was the day my attorney forwarded me a copy of one of Ethan's responses during the division process where he referred to the trip as a regrettable error in judgment. Error in judgment. Not accident. Not misunderstanding. Not tragic coincidence. In trying to sound controlled and strategic, he gave away more than he understood. Because only someone who had made a judgment can later refer to it as an error. That sentence was the closest he ever came to telling the truth. People also ask whether I think he truly meant to kill me, or whether he just created conditions where he could let nature do something convenient. I've thought about that question more than anyone should have to. Maybe he did not know with certainty that I would drown. Maybe he told himself he was only creating possibility, only increasing risk, only letting fate make a choice he was too cowardly to make directly. But there is no meaningful moral comfort in that distinction. If you arrange the scene, study the outcome, and stand ready to benefit from your wife's death, you do not get to hide inside technicalities. Intent is not made cleaner because water leaves fewer fingerprints than hands. The strangest part of rebuilding was how much of my life I had to relearn as safe. Water, yes, but also planning itself. Generosity, romance, surprise. For a long time, every thoughtful gesture from anyone felt vaguely suspicious because I had learned too violently that care and calculation can share a face. Therapy helped, though not in the pretty way people describe healing online. It helped like physical rehab helps after a bad injury. Repetition, breath, naming what happened. Learning not to flinch from your own memory. Some days I hated that I had to do so much work to recover from a crime he never fully confessed to. Other days I felt almost ferociously grateful just to be alive enough to hate it. There was one final moment with Ethan that mattered, and it came almost a year after the trip. We were in mediation over one of the last unresolved financial pieces, and during a break he asked if he could speak to me alone for 1 minute. I said no at first. Then I changed my mind because part of me wanted to know whether there was any version of truth left in him. He looked older, not tragic, just stripped. He said he was sorry for everything and that he knew there was nothing he could say that I would ever believe. For once, he was right. Then he said, "I never thought you'd see it that way." That sentence still chills me. Not because it was a confession, though maybe in some accidental way it was, because it revealed the core of people like him. Their faith is never in innocence. Their faith is in your perception. They do not need to be good. They just need you to see them as good long enough. I almost died on that trip. That is the simplest truth in this entire story. I almost died because the man who knew exactly how to make me feel safe also knew exactly how to design danger in a form I would step into willingly. I survived because a guide did his job faster than my husband did his role. I survived because instinct and luck and another man's professionalism intersected in the right second. And once I survived, the most important thing I did was not prove his intent to every person beyond all possible doubt. It was believe myself before he could talk me out of what my life already knew. That matters more than people think. Women are taught to demand impossible certainty from themselves before they act. We are taught that unless the evidence is cinematic, unless the villain slips up in a way that satisfies everyone else's standards, we should stay, explain, empathize, and wait for more information. But survival often depends on moving before the story is neat. If something in you is screaming that the person beside you is no longer safe, do not wait for your fear to become aesthetically pleasing to outsiders. I am alive because once the pattern appeared, I chose movement over perfect proof. I used to think the worst thing Ethan took from me was trust. It was. Trust can be rebuilt slowly with the right people and enough time. The worst thing he tried to take was authorship. He tried to design not just my death, but the story of my death. He tried to create a version of events where my body, my life, my marriage, and even my ending could be interpreted through his presentation. The reason telling this matters to me is because I lived. He does not get to own the narrative of what almost happened. He does not get a tragic husband's grief arc. He does not get candlelit sympathy and black suits and people saying life is cruel. He gets this instead. A living woman who saw the plan, named the pattern, and walked away breathing. So if you want more stories like this, subscribe now. There's a lot more coming. And before you go, here's another story you don't want to miss. It's another betrayal story that starts with trust, turns darker than expected, and ends somewhere no one sees coming. Click into that next one because it will absolutely surprise you.